我今天呢是感到特别兴奋，来介绍我自己在芝加哥大学读书的时候的一位老师 ，James Heckman。赫克曼教授他是1944年出生于芝加哥附近，1971年在普林斯顿大学拿到经济学博士学位，1973年开始在芝加哥大学当教授。我到芝大读书的时候是1982年，当时呢他到芝加哥大学工作也正好前后10年。但是那时候虽然他是芝加哥大学里面一个比较年轻的教授，可是我们同学之间呢都已经知道他一定会拿到诺贝尔奖。然后在芝大读书的时候，我们第1年、第2年工作真是非常努力，没有白天，没有黑夜。但是对我们最大的安慰是说，当我们很累的时候，我们知道黑克曼教授都还在工作，所以我们应该更努力工作。那么我想就以这样的一个简单介绍我们请黑克曼教授来跟我们谈谈人力资本投资和中国经济发展。现在我们邀请黑克曼教授。
I want to thank people for the introduction, and I must say I'm very happy to be here today to be able to talk about my own understanding of the current state of human capital policy in China. So today I want to try to stick to the facts, but recognize that the facts in China are very rapidly changing, and that an understanding of Chinese policy, especially from afar, is always hampered by the fact that the structure of the data is not entirely clear, and the situation is so rapidly changing as part of economic development. Today, I want to start with an observation that actually began when I was here in China last in 2001. I was asked to speak in a conference on Western capital markets in Chongqing in June of 2001. And as a participant in that conference, I was surprised by the emphasis at that time in the conference on formation of capital markets, physical capital markets, bond and equity markets, and financing of factories and the like. But I was surprised there was so little emphasis on education and training. So looking at statistics, and it's always dangerous to do economic history, and this is historical in part. Looking at the statistics after I returned from Chongqing, I was impressed by the fact that in 1995, that China, at all levels of government, spent about 2.5% of its GDP on investment in schooling. And I was also struck by the fact that at that time, about 30% of its GDP was devoted to physical investment. And the comparable figures with which I was more familiar in the United States was basically 5.4% and 17% for human capital investment and physical capital investment in the United States. So if you compare the Chinese experience to comparable to countries around the world in 1995 again, you see that the 2.5% in China is relatively low. For example, if you compare a country like the United States, it's 5.4%. India was 3.3%. Thailand, 4.1%. And compared to many other countries, Germany, 4.8%. Canada, 7%. That this 2.5% figure looks relatively low. If you look at the time series, of course, and this is something much discussed in current Chinese circles, is that there has been an expansion of government expenditure. Not only has been a big growth in GDP, but the share of growth has actually, share of government expenditure on education has increased, and increased from up to about 3.1, and I'm understanding today that it may be as high as 3.3%. So in my lecture today, I want to make 6 main points. The first point is to remind you or acquaint you with the idea that the benefits of human capital investment are substantial. And the second point I want to make is that at current level of investment in capital in China is low by worldwide standards and is lower than it would be if growth were promoted in an optimal way. And I would want to emphasize that at the current level of investment, which I think is low, artificially low, that the investments in human capital are inequitably and inefficiently distributed across geographical regions, across rural and urban areas within regions, and also between rural people living in urban areas and urban people. Many economists, and those of you who studied economics, will know that a very common theme is sometimes the trade-off between efficiency and equity. But I want to argue that in the current Chinese context, there is no trade-off between equity and efficiency, that in a policy that promotes efficiency will also promote equity and reduce inequality. I want to also argue that the imbalance in investment in human capital compared to physical capital in the current economy reduces the return to physical capital and actually has thwarted initiatives in physical investment designed to foster growth in interior China. A more balanced portfolio of investment will promote economic growth and reduce inequality. Open labor markets, functioning markets for loans to human capital, and fewer restrictions on mobility of workers will foster human capital at little cost to government. This is a very important consideration because in thinking about policy options for China, one must also think more than just about increasing government budgets, but recognize the full forces of private incentives and unleash those incentives to finance human capital and to promote the growth of human capital and the equalization of access to human capital. So let me just remind you about two crucial benefits of human capital investment. One I think is fairly well known, and maybe even obvious, but a second may be even more important for China. First of all, human capital raises the skills of people. So if you're trained in law, if you're trained in accounting, if you're trained in engineering, you become a better person in terms of being able to do accounting, engineering, and law. But a second benefit, and one that's not sufficiently appreciated, is that human capital improves adaptability and the allocative efficiency of resources in society. This is especially important because in a time of change, the return to human capital, the return to education, the return to ability is particularly strong. For generations now, economists have been talking about how market forces work. The word sometimes is used, creative destruction, because the world of new technology, the world of open trade, essentially makes new opportunities, and it makes also old opportunities obsolete compared to the new opportunities. So you don't need me to tell you this, but China is changing rapidly. And as China enters world markets, and as it becomes a global partner and a more and more major element in the economy, there's a need for a more skilled workforce can only increase. By world standards, the percentage of college-educated workers and even high-skilled non-college educated workers is relatively low. We see that Beijing, which is of course, the center in China, has a relatively high educated workforce. But if you look across other parts of China, outside of Xinjiang and Shanghai, we get relatively low rates, sort of small rates. So the opportunity, the room for improvement in the skill is real. So the question is, how do we know that there might be, or there is, underinvestment in human capital in China? And is there inefficient geographical distribution of human capital investment? How can we say this? Let's look. I want to give you a few facts. Now, there's a very wide variation in the wealth of provinces of China, and schooling is funded at the local level, largely, not totally. So it is the case that rich provinces tend to produce more human capital per capita than do poor provinces. So, for example, if we look at the schooling finances and we ask the percentage of government appropriations as a percent of GDP, we get very substantial variations. So not only is there a wealth level variation across regions, but there are income level variation, but there is in addition different shares of government budgets being spent on education. Now, part of the current policy involves charging of fees. And we know, and in fact there's a good idea sometimes to charge fees. The reason being is that it's one way to ration scarce resources for people who might benefit most from education. In a period in situations where government funds are scarce and some individuals have a high demand and high willingness and ability to pay, that rationing by price system can be a very efficient mechanism for allocating scarce goods. And we know that the extent of subsidy in Chinese education is substantial as well.
胜利之鹰，
追求丽君境界，品质丽君本色，卓越品质，孜孜追求，丽君药。
红梅王，王者风范，能造飞机轮胎的嘉通集团。
瞄准财经动态，比对前后走势，看准企业要员，提问尖锐议题，对准经济脉搏，一起一伏，掌握财经世界新形势。招行特约财经点对点，周四晚上10点35分，凤凰卫视中文台。
But if we look at the distribution, we can see that the current fee structure, which might have some economic basis, does tend to operate inequitably between urban and rural households. So these fees are a substantial fraction of household income in rural areas. And when you add to this the fact that the quality of schooling tends to be lower, it only reinforces the point that access to schooling, the quality of schooling, and the mere price of schooling, very, very different between rural and urban areas. And yet, if you think that the Chinese people are basically the same people around all over the country, this represents a substantial element, not only of social inequality, but of economic inefficiency. So, a question that I raised at the very beginning of the lecture was, well, what is the rate of return? If the rate of return is as low as 4%, as was estimated, and the return to physical capital is as high as 20%, so the rate of return to education is 4%, as high as 20%. In a paper with Li Shusong, who's here today, we estimated maybe as high as 7 to 8% in recent years, and I've recently become aware of estimates that may be as high as 10 or 11%. Still, if you compare it to some of the estimates of 20%, these numbers are thrown around, so one can never be completely solid. And one might say, well, the rate of return to education in China is relatively low. China shouldn't invest so much in human capital. And if you look at the conventional way of measuring rates of return, that's the kind of message you might take from the data. So for example, a study by Fleischer and Wang, again, historical data, looked at direct productivity estimates. So instead of looking at wage data, how markets work, and we know the markets are distorted. Labor markets are not very competitive in China, even today. But if you look at the return to education by estimating how much does an extra year of education raise the production at a plant, output, which actually underestimates the total productivity of education, because there are many other benefits to education other than its direct effect on output, that the econometric studies suggest, at least for that period, the return to education might be as high as 30 to 40%. And even if we cut that figure in half, we still get a very, very high return, which is certainly comparable, and I would argue greater, than the return to physical capital investment today. I think it's fair to say that labor markets in China gave the wrong incentives to workers in the 1980s and early 1990s, and that borrowing from that experience, I think they still do. I think that it's still the case that in many sectors of the economy, the payment to education is not the right return to education. Therefore, we must think more broadly. Now, there's another aspect of the return to education, And a feature of modern technology and modern economies is that the return to capital is determined in part by the availability of skilled workers. And Fleischer and Chen in an earlier study show that the returns to education actually exceed the return to investment in all provinces except Beijing, Tianjin, and Shanghai. And the reason for this is that in those provinces there's a fairly high level of education. And in the other provinces, there's a relatively low level of education, making education scarce, also turning out to reduce the investment, the returns to investment, because a more skilled workforce actually produces higher returns on physical investment. So what policies might we suggest? Well, the low private return to education relative to what seems to be a higher social return is evidence of some distortion. And I think it's the case that current policy reduces private incentives of individuals to acquire the appropriate amount of human capital. So I think that we must understand that when we think about education and we think about human capital policy, and human capital is much broader than education, that we should include on-the-job training. It also includes the formation of skill in the family. But when we think about it, we have to think beyond the presumption that's so common in policy that we have to rely solely on government policy to change the funding of education. It's an important message. Many people equate human capital with schooling. Many people assume that the government is the only source of funding for schooling. But in fact, if we understand how markets work, how incentives work, that reforms in labor markets act as a powerful force for promoting human capital accumulation that requires no further increase, no increase at all necessarily in the government's budget, but that requires sort of a redirection, an elimination, I should say, of distortions from the current labor market, and the development of institutions that allow both the labor market and human capital markets to operate effectively. So one way, of course, to encourage education and job training is to subsidize it, to depend on the government. And so it's difficult sometimes. People argue, well, there's already been a very substantial increase in government expenditure. The government budget is limited, and it may not be feasible or may be very difficult to increase direct government support for education. Although one could argue that redirection, even within the fixed budgets, towards human capital as opposed to physical capital would be a very useful, would improve the performance of the economy and create mobility. But there's another way. And the other way, which I've mentioned now and would emphasize again, is the notion that if we free up labor markets for human capital, allow private incentives to operate, and increase the markets for borrowing and lending in human capital, that without spending another penny of government revenue, one can substantially promote the formation of human capital. Now, within this class of policies, another policy would be equalization of urban and rural rates of return to human capital, which would essentially be facilitated by mobility, and both capital and labor mobility. We know that if we open up the labor market and we allow wages to become more competitive, and we allow skilled workers to get what the value of their product is in producing output for the larger society, that is a force that acts and has always acted, and especially in developing countries, towards increasing wages in the short run. Wages of skilled labor are bid up. Why? First of all, with economic development, you need more skilled workers. As the economy develops, more skilled workers are needed. Secondly, it takes skilled workers to make skilled workers. So in a time when an economy is growing, market economies would operate in a way towards sending a price signal, making the return to education higher at a time when more skilled labor is needed, not only in production, but in producing the people needed in the production. So when we discuss inequality, and we have to discuss inequality in this lecture, we have to understand that there are different sources of inequality and there are different justifications for inequality. One type of inequality, the kind I'm talking about right now, when wages are bid up for skilled workers because they produce something, it's demanded, scarce, that this produces the right incentives for people to acquire skills. People, if they could borrow against their future earnings, and some of the restrictions in capital markets were open, human capital market lending and borrowing were eliminated, would be more than happy, well, maybe not more than happy, but would be willing to pay for their own education. This is not something that requires any expansion of government activity. It simply allows people who have a demand for education to gain access to it, possibly through lending and borrowing. But a high price for skilled labor sends a signal to those people and makes it more attractive to become educated. Given the right rewards and access to capital markets, people will pay tuition for schooling. And the schools themselves would gain resources directly from the students they educate. So what am I suggesting? I'm suggesting fees, but with human capital markets, and with labor markets that essentially reward the returns to the education that people acquire. But this requires that credit markets for schooling be developed. In the absence of such markets, credit markets for schooling, and so I'm suggesting really changing not only capital policy, but the financing of capital policy, allowing more of the financial pools and resources to go in loans and credits to people for their education. In the absence of such markets, only young people from wealthy families, from wealthy provinces, can afford to go to school. And this creates a form of inequity and inequality and, also economic inefficiency. So let me discuss the question of inequality, because it's much discussed in China today. Just to review the points, we know that open labor markets associated with competition, especially in a time of dynamic growth like appears in China, often lead to greater inequality in wages. And we know that more educated, more able people, exactly the type that are needed to develop the economy of China, benefit more from this new openness and from growth. But it's very important to understand that the main source of inequality in China today is not the inequality between high-skilled and low-skilled workers in urban markets, but a major source, in fact I would argue the major source of inequality in China today, is the difference between rural and urban incomes and between those people who gain access to education and those people who don't have access to education. Those are the fundamental determinants of inequality in China today. Never mind the rise of the markup in returns to schooling that have happened in the last few years. And so again, emphasizing a theme that I've stated repeatedly, that there is no trade-off in China, I think, between efficiency and equity or equality. That current restrictions on labor migration from rural to urban areas, the holdover of previous Fuku policies, and restrictions on the migration, the education fees charged children of immigrants, are a major source of inequality today in this society. Far more important in my mind and my understanding of the data than any wage differential created by an opening labor market. And we know that labor reallocation in the past 10 years has been a major source of Chinese growth. Work done here at CCER by Lin, Wang, and Zhao show, in fact, that this is an important component and that one force towards increasing growth is increasing migration, but also that migration tends to reduce inequality or is a force towards reducing inequality. So once more we see that there is no trade-off. In fact, there's a sense that part of a redistribution policy, a policy that emphasizes equality, is a policy that also enforces and suggests the increase in efficiency and economic growth of the society. So we know that migration alone is going to be very difficult. In this very paper I just cited by authors here at CCER, we know that if we just rely on migration policy alone, that would be a force towards promoting growth. That would help actually reduce income inequality in the country at large. But we know that it would have to be enormous, unaided by any other investments. That migration would actually have to quadruple by these current estimates. So migration supplemented by human capital investment will promote growth and will reduce inequality. So again, it's a question of opening up markets, not of increasing the size of the government share, not of increasing the burden of taxation, not of relying on the center, but relying on private initiatives and relying on free incentives in the society. In other words, relying on China, what China has been doing for 25 years, but maybe increasing its reliance.
胜利之鹰，
走一趟湖南，画一道城市天空线，连接红太阳升起的一域，与沈从文进行心灵交通，发先天下之悠而优之豪情，赴千年学府，思孔孟之道，完成一次与历史和自然的交谈。中国湖南。
画出心中缤纷，凤凰卫视祝您圣诞及新年多姿多彩。
So in summary on inequality, I think it's important to understand that there are different types of inequality. That the discussion now currently relevant and prevalent, I should say, in China is that inequality is something to be feared and something to be eliminated. And I think that's a false statement, a false understanding of what the role of inequality is. Certain types of inequalities should be reduced, but other types of inequalities can play a very powerful role, especially in the short run. So we should understand that the inequality that arises from the operation of open markets actually plays a very important role in the growth process in stimulating people to acquire skills. And we should also understand that current policies towards access to education, towards migration, and the operation that shuts down the operation of markets are actually forces that they themselves promote inequality under the name of reducing it. And I think it's incorrect to assume, as I detect in the reading from afar of current policy, that inequality is associated with free labor markets. I would argue that free labor markets and correct operation of incentives certainly reduces long-run inequality, and in many aspects of the current components of inequality today, reduce inequality, not increase it. So let me conclude with three main points. The first is that if we look at the true rate of return and apply methods that I think are better suited to the Chinese context, that the true rate of return to education is very high. It may be as high as 30–40%. That may be too high now, but it's certainly true that even though there is been an increase in the quantity of people schooled, very rapid increase, there's still a very high demand, and the rate of return, the fundamentals are very high towards increasing, sustaining that demand for education. Second point I want to emphasize is that certainly all the evidence points to the fact that Chinese economic performance is going to be improved in terms of productivity by having more human capital and increasing the level of an educated and skilled workforce. And my third point is that economic efficiency, economic performance, economic growth, productivity is not in conflict with social equality. That improving productivity will be equalized, will be enhanced by equalizing returns across all types of investments, physical and human, by reducing regional inequalities in access to education, and by reducing the dependence of educational decisions on income of parents. And that the trade-off in China doesn't exist. That in fact, there is a sense of efficient redistribution, that access to education, improving the skills of the workforce will promote social equality, not reduce it. and will enhance economic productivity. So I want to conclude the conclusions by emphasizing that nothing that I say today is intended to be critical of the trends in Chinese policy. In many ways, the trends in Chinese policy are exactly as I've outlined in this lecture. But I think maybe the scale, the pace could be accelerated. China is truly one of the most, maybe the most dynamic economy in the world. And the opportunities for growth, not only of an economic base, but of human welfare and social welfare are enormous. And so any scholar from outside China can only be attracted by the scale of the economy, the scale of the change in the economy and the change in the society. My remarks today are intended only to suggest that a good thing can get better, and that in fact the Chinese economy, which is truly exciting, and the Chinese society, which is truly a great society, can only be enhanced by continuing its vision of social equality and economic productivity. So thank you for your attention.
我有3个评论3个问题。第一个的话呢，就是我完全赞成他的那个6个观点，尤其是这个短期和长期的效应，这个教育在这个不平等的问题上。第二个的话，我特别赞成他这个金融市场改革要给教育的话呢，给这个信贷。第3个我也很赞成，就是说这个某种形式上的这个不平等，实际上呢会这个有正面的效果，在短期里面，他认为，我怀疑很可能还有长期的效果，因为我个人感觉到，中国的区域不平衡正是中国经济发展的一个主要动力，因为区域竞争非常强烈，相对于美国和欧洲的比较均衡的社会，中国更有活力。我还有3个问题或者迷惑的地方。That's one question. 如果我看他这个数据是看不同国家的数据的话，我就会发现中国的教育的程度比起东欧和印度还要差，但是增长要比它快。所以我怀疑这相关的关系呢，这个正相关的关系不是在这个教育和增长率，而是在教育和技术发展的程度，或者说教育和生活的质量。那么如果中国增加这个教育的这个程度，就像这个发达国家一样，我想可能会降低增长率，但是换来的代价呢是改善人们的生活品质和技术程度。所以这是第一个question。Second question， Heckman 教授认为中国这个不平等的这个现象在教育上面，尤其区域的，包括这个城乡的或者是沿海和内地的，主要可能是由于劳工市场的限制造成的。那么我的观察呢，好像相反，就是说这些年我们这个劳力的这个流动要比以前强，所以这个劳工市场上的竞争好像不但没有减少不平等，反而是加速增加这个不平等。但另外一方面呢，在这个供给方那一边，因为我们中国的教育，尤其是高等教育是政府垄断的，所以教育的成本的急剧增加，很可能是因为在供给方的垄断造成，而不是这个需求方的这个劳工市场造成。这是我的第二个这个观察。The third question 就是说，在减少教育方面的不平等里面，到底中国是应该市场扮演一个更重要的作用呢，还是政府应该扮演一个更重要的作用？那么 Heckman 教授呢认为，市场的力量呢，如果起更大作用的话，能够减少这个不平等。那么我的看法呢，好像是相反，因为即使我观察发达国家的高等教育，高等教育的成长主要不是由于盈利的机制来推动，而是非盈利的机制来推动，即使对于私立的大学。而中国这些年来教育成本的急剧增加，恰好说明中国政府在教育问题上采取的不是累进所得税，而是累退所得税的这种激励机制。所以呢，我的感觉，中国在鼓励市场这个开放这个方面，当然中国还要打破这个 政府对高等教育上垄断，但是另外一方面，我想可能中国在税收政策上面要采取更加累进所得税的办法，而不是现在实质上是累退所得税的办法。我想听听Heckman 教授的评论。
So I'm very pleased to receive these comments and other comments. Let me respond to the last point first. I'll go back in reverse order because they're fresh in mind. The important thing that I really didn't emphasize is that when we think about human capital and skill, a major component of human capital is actually training in the workplace. It's on-the-job training. If you think about yourself privately, just think about your own life, we know that much is gained from textbook education. In school, you learn how to learn. But we know that in the workplace, you learn how to earn. And so what you do, there is lifetime learning that has been estimated to be as much as 1/3 to a half of all the skills you acquire are not by sitting in a classroom, but actually by doing, learning by doing. And where does this learning take place? It takes place in companies. It takes place in marketplace settings. It takes place on the job. As people are also producing goods, they also produce their own self-investments. And that improving the incentives and the flexibility of the workplace makes it easier to arrange between workers and firms the financing of human capital, the acquisition of skill. So for example, just like students here today, the students here today are paying tuition or paying some tuition to attend, workers who are attending or working in a factory or a workplace setting which gives them much skill might take a lower wage if wages were flexible. Why? Because they acquire a skill that will pay off the rest of their lives. Here, we need a broader view of how human capital is formed, and we look beyond the features of educational institutions to features of the labor market that would make that learning possible, that would allow even greater amount. For example, in Germany and in many Western European countries, apprentices are very productive components of the society. Why? Because they acquire skills while working. It's learning that's motivated by a particular application in the company they're working for or the industry they're working for. And at the same time, financing problems that can sometimes be difficult for students can be overcome by essentially making deals between workers and firms way outside the scope of government.
胜利之鹰。
以色列总统卡查夫上任后首度访华。
China is one of the most powerful state in the world, and I believe that China can contribute positively.
下周小丽看世界，带您了解国际局势中的中以关系。
王朝特约小丽看世界，周一晚上10点35分，凤凰卫视中文台。
And so we know, and I'd agree completely with your suggestion, that your comment that in fact elements of monopoly and the provision of education may drive up costs and may prevent access to some forms of human capital that are, of course, very important, schooling. But I would emphasize that, again, of course, the one lesson that China's learned, and learned very well in the last 25 years, is that increasing incentives, making people more competitive, opening up competition, we say even in access to education, allowing schools to enter, allowing more foreign institutions to come in and provide schooling. That kind of competition and those kinds of incentivizations will only serve to improve the efficiency of the government provision of education. So There's no question that the entry of more private schools, the entry of more actors into the education market and to the job training market can only help to promote both equality of access and also promoting the production of human capital. And so I would agree that a reliance strictly, if I interpret your question or part of your question, one of your questions correctly, that the structure of reliance on the government sector is going to lead to some inevitable frustration. And there's no need to. It's so common. This is not true just in China. It's true around the world. People think about education, they think of governments. Well, that's part of the story, and government has a very important role to play. But it can be supplemented by essentially having an active private sector. I think one of the reasons why the United States has a high level of excellence in graduate education and in post-secondary schooling is that public schools have very active competition from private schools, and this creates excellence for both. And so I would agree that monopoly in any sector, whether it's education or business or any other aspect of economic life, tends to drive up costs and probably is a force towards promoting inequality. And that just suggests all the more why entry into education, allowing more institutions, private institutions, to set up, it can only increase the access to education and reduce the cost. And also in its form and on-the-job training, allowing firms to set up work-based training as rivals to education can only promote the formation of human capital and increase choice in the larger society. So 2 other points. First, the issue of what is the source of inequality in Chinese society today. I think we still need to know the facts. So going back to this motto over Yulin Academy, I'd say stick to the facts, and I don't know all the facts, but my perception of the facts, and I'm happy to be corrected by the better informed Chinese scholars in this room, is that the urban-rural difference is still a major component, and that I would argue that if you decompose inequality down into the component that's due to restrictions due to labor market mobility, restrictions due to geographic mobility that's partly labor market mobility, and restrictions in access to education, that's going to be a much greater component of the total source of inequality in the Chinese society than anything having to do with the open functioning of markets. It's an important empirical question. It needs to be answered for China. I'm willing to bet some money on the proposition because I actually think it's extremely important for understanding and guiding economic policy today. But I think that if this conjecture is correct, that this would essentially possibly deflect, redirect, cause us to reinterpret what the growing inequality is, see the positive face of it, and then understand the negative aspects of inequality and eliminate those. And those seem to be entirely consistent with the government policy in China for the last 50 years to promote equality, to access to education, and to access to the larger society. And so in terms of response to your first question, I would argue that certainly the empirical evidence is very weak about any simple correlation between education and growth. That's not by itself. We know, you can look around you in China and know that the main engine of growth is providing people with the incentives to acquire and to acquire and be excellent. But my suggestion was simply that in the long run, and even in the short run, this process can only be facilitated. And I doubt that in 100 years, when China really emerges as a fully functioning, full partner in the world economy, it would want to stay with its comparative advantage that it currently has today, which is an unskilled labor. I think the very forces of growth can only be improved by this. So yes, incentives are paramount, far more important than education per se. Countries like Cuba have very high levels of education and extremely low levels of growth. So it's not a question of education. It's a question of incentives. But improving the education, changing the strategy, allowing China to develop both its skilled workforce and its unskilled workforce will actually allow a good thing to be even better.
Good afternoon, Mr. Heckman. I have two questions. Number one, the Chinese government is now adopting a policy to make the education sector or the higher education sector an industry that generates profits. So in your opinion, is it kind of deduction or increase in terms of investment on human resources? And then my second question is, now China is lacking in skilled workers, but many enterprises in China now is also neglecting the training of their employees as a means to cut the expenditure of the company. So how do you comment on this?
Well, first of all, to take the second point, I'm not familiar with this particular phenomenon, so I can't discuss the details, but the general point I can. And that is, that, first of all, a lot of learning that takes place on the company is not in formal company classes even. It's just from producing. I mean, a huge amount comes from workers who essentially work with a product and learn to make a better product. But cutting back on expenditures doesn't sound like a good idea, but it could well be that it's a consequence of the wage-setting policy in China. I mean, if in fact companies are giving general education to the workers, and this can be taken anywhere, and firms can't get paid for it, they train a worker and then the worker quits, and you can't essentially get compensation as a firm, then labor market policy that prevents wages from adjusting can essentially promote this and reduce the amount of training. How does that work? Just like tuition. It works like tuition. A firm provides a training opportunity, workers would be willing to pay for it. How do workers pay for training on the job? Lower initial wages. But if wages can't be lowered and the training is useful for all other people, then it makes a problem, and firms are probably not going to provide the training. Here's a question where we sort of think outside the box and say a policy that promotes labor market flexibility is one also that could promote training. So there we want to put these two together. Instead of separating these in different segments, we think of them as part and parcel of a general policy of incentivizing the labor market and giving people the right incentives. The first question I can answer briefly, which is, I don't know the details again of the policy of allowing firms, higher institutions of learning, educational institutions to earn profits. So I can't comment on that. But I can say this, that when you allow competition for faculty, for students, and you allow firms, universities to compete openly in terms of faculty salaries, in terms of student quality, in terms of curricula, we know from experience in the United States that improves excellence in all parties, private or public. So in that sense, I think it can be very good. What you want to avoid is what happened in England, though. Under Thatcher, when there was a sense of trying to incentivize the school system, but it was done so by firms offering, or universities bidding on courses for students. And so there was a sense in which people, small universities, made money by essentially providing education at, quote, low cost. But typically quality was sacrificed in that dimension. So I would not have it as a strictly government. I don't know the details, but as long as you don't have some kind of policy which can be gotten around by, like in this case, lowering quality, incentivizing this certainly would help. And we know from the American, I think the successful American higher educational establishment comes strictly as a result of that kind of competition.
你好，我是北大新闻网的记者。我想问一个问题，就是您刚才一直在强调技术工人在中国的需求很大，同时技术工人的培训一般是职业培训或者是终身培训。那么在中国日益普及的大学教育中，大学教育能够对这个职业工人培训产生一种什么样的作用？还有就是您说的人力资本投资能够对大学教育产生什么样的影响
？Some experience around the world with university institutions of higher education working directly with companies, and I know that's going on in China, where developments are made. I mean, I saw this already, heard some discussions of this in Changsha. I can't believe it's not being done in Beijing. So the companies are using scientists and engineers and scholars to help develop components, to redevelop and improve the products. But there is a symbiosis between universities, maybe not premier research universities as much as sort of schools of intermediate quality, where there can be a very large investment made in the skills of workers by having workplace-based training programs that are like something like a university extension services. In the United States, for example, and versions of this appear in other countries, there's a very active system of so-called community colleges, which are not as academic as this university is, but they do provide a very basic set of training skills in an academic environment, sometimes in an academic environment mixed with a workplace environment. So, for example, in Chicago, there's a community college called Triton Junior College, community college. It actually trains General Motors workers in skills that are very useful, gives them basic education, math skills, computer skills. The workers continue to work for General Motors. They take their training with this company. At the same time, they are at this college. And so they gain basic skills. They improve their ability, literacy, mathematics skills, and at the same time, they expand the productivity of the workers on the job and teach workers the particulars of the General Motors system. So my suspicion is, and I did a little bit of informal investigation on this in Chongqing 2 years ago, that this kind of system, although there are versions of it in place, could be expanded. And so the emphasis on sort of practical investments, partnerships between universities and firms, there's a real avenue for growth. There's some of this being done, but it's a very important avenue. And the virtue of it, again, is it's partly self-financing. You don't require money from the center. Companies are willing to put up the money, they get trained workforce, and they also get the benefit of the ideas that the university provides. So again, more of these reaching out of hands across different institutions within the society, not expecting everything to come from the center, can only increase the opportunities for building skills here.
谢谢大家。